So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tara La, Emergency Services Lived Experience and Strategic Engagement Lead at Black Dog Institute. And she's going to be presenting on Reconstructing Meaning After Suicide, an approach to frontline postvention informed by research and lived experience. So thanks very much, Tara.
Thank you, Pip. Thanks so much. It's really, really great to be here. And thank you for coming to this presentation on Reconstructing Meaning After Suicide, an approach to frontline postvention informed by research and lived experience. So I want to start by acknowledging that this is a really challenging topic for almost everybody. It brings up a lot of emotions for many people who, like myself, come to this with our own lived and living experience of suicide. So I just want to invite you all to create a safe space here, a safe, compassionate space to hold all sorts of emotion. If you need to step away, please do, and make use of the supports that are available. So just a quick outline. I'm going to start with that question, why, and look at the impact of suicide, why the cultural context matters, worldviews and belief systems, and then 4 themes that underpin impact, and some of that comes from my own research. I'm also drawing on other people's research as well as my own. And what can we actually do? And looking at preparedness, postvention and prevention, and short, medium and long-term postvention strategies. And then hopefully I'll leave some time for questions. So why? This is really what separates or makes suicide a different type of death to other types of violent and traumatic deaths. And it's almost universal in the experience after people have been impacted by suicide to question why. And one of the participants in my PhD research, he said to me, the hardest thing to come to terms with was why. Why'd he do it? You just don't know where people go with their thoughts, so I'll never really know what happened or what set him off. There's just no sense. I've got no answer. No one has, as to why he done what he done. But we also know that research has shown that the struggle to understand that question why provides the greatest driver of growth following suicide. So what can we actually do to promote some sort of growth from the impact of suicide rather than experience illness and distress, or alongside illness and distress even? So the impact of suicide on frontline workers. We know that there is an accumulative impact, which Tim and Leo both mentioned, through multiple exposures, and that might come in the form of personal loss, the loss of a colleague, and through occupational exposure. And most of the participants that I spoke to, many first responders, will have an experience of 3 different types of exposure to suicide. After exposure to suicide, there is an increased risk of suicide, suicidal distress, and suicidal behaviour. And so that really speaks to why suicide postvention is an absolutely integral part of suicide prevention. We also know that there's an increased risk of depression, anxiety, and PTSD, and that's been shown in military and first responder populations. There's an increased experience of social isolation, which relates to the stigma that still really exists around suicide and the silencing that is kind of part of that process and still exists around suicide, and the inability to speak, like it's very much a silent story. And it leads to greater feelings of guilt, shame, helplessness, and anger towards the deceased, towards the self, and others compared to those exposed to other types of loss and death. Also, really importantly, we know that culture defines the impact, and we often don't think about culture in terms of impact. The impact can be independent of the closeness of the relationship to the deceased. And that's really, really important in first responder populations who, as we've seen already, experience lots of occupational exposure to suicide where the person isn't known to them, and yet we know from research that there's really significant impact. So we can't just look at the closeness of the relationship. And that's been demonstrated in paramedics, police officers, and in firefighters. So there's a real need for a shift in perspective. So to date, the focus has very much been on, as I said, the closeness of the relationship. Most of the research that we have is looking at family members who have lost a family member to suicide. And so that's really looked through a bereavement lens. And a lot of the research is focused on using quantitative research where we used specific validated scales and measures. But what that doesn't do is speak to the really human experience of suicide, how we actually experience that. So there's a real need to move towards looking at perceived impact. What is the perceived impact on a person of that death? Not based around the closeness of the relationship. And we need to look at it from through the lens of trauma and meaning-making within the cultural and social context, and also using qualitative research, which is driven by lived experience. And that was really the lens. So my PhD research, which explored the impact of suicide on firefighters, very much took that perspective from a qualitative perspective, informed by lived experience. So what we know is suicide disrupts frontline workers' familiar ways of understanding the world, ourselves, and ourselves in the world. And when I talk about that, I'm talking about trauma not in terms of a medicalised kind of definition of trauma, but a broader definition of trauma. And if any of you are familiar with Ronnie Yanov-Bullman's work on shattered assumptions, and that's based around how trauma impacts our belief systems and shatters our assumptions about the world and our worldviews, the way that we exist in the world, and our core belief systems. So when we look at understanding the impact of suicide, what we know is there's a really complex interplay of grief and loss experiences, fear-based responses, and shame-based responses. And it's messy because grief is it's something we express. Shame is very much of a kind of closing in of the self, and fear is a more hypervigilance. So that they're very different experiential responses. But what I'm going to sort of show over the next 20 minutes or so is that for first responders, that trauma part and the morally injurious part and where that comes in are kind of amplified, if you like, in the context of how we exist in the world and the cultures and organisations and the roles that we play. But really importantly, all of those experiences are set within the cultural context, within the social context, and within the experiential context of the individual. So the cultural and organisational context in which suicide occurs fundamentally determines its impact on individuals and organisations. So understanding the cultural context, and I'm going to speak here specifically about firefighters, but I hope that from your different organisations that you can look through the lens of what your own cultures, organisational cultures are. And obviously there's a lot of similarities between police, firefighters, paramedics, and between military and defence populations. So within the firefighter organisational context, we are paramilitary and hierarchical organisations which are very, very highly structured. We work under a command and control environment, and we have a high trauma load. And so we all know that all of those things actually impact how we exist in the world. And when we start to look at how that might affect us in terms of the impact of suicide, it becomes really interesting in seeing why that can amplify its impact. We have a really strong sense of mission to protect life. So our primary purpose is to protect life. So what does that mean to us when there's an intentional act to end life? We have very strong operational and occupational identities and a world that's very much defined by rationality, by order, and by control. But we work within organisations which by their nature divest us of the control. We have a really strong code of camaraderie and self-reliance and stoicism. So how does that influence our beliefs, our identities, and our ways of being? We're very rational, logic-driven, task-focused, action-orientated problem solvers. And one of my participants said to me, he said, you need to know the answers. The how, there's always an answer, but with a why, there's not going to be any answers. And that becomes really important relating back to that question, why? There's a real desire and a need to be in control. And one of my participants said to me, how do you know if you can't control it? How do you know? I just needed to prove that I was in control. And that last bit speaks to an experience that he had where he was in a position where he could have taken his own life, but he didn't describe it as a suicide attempt. He said, I just needed to prove that I was in control. And that really speaks to that altered relationship to control. Identity as the rescuer. Again, one of my participants said, he said, I am always the rescuer. I am never the rescuee. A quarantining of the emotional world. Again, a participant said to me, every time there's a fatality, I think you just sort of try and put up a wall and try and separate the emotion from the reality. So that becomes a learned way of being in the world. I should be strong. And again, a participant said, because of the uniform, the persona that we perceive that we're supposed to be. There's a lot of shoulds. I should be strong. I should be this. I should react like this. The closeness of the bond. And again, a participant said to me, I'm closer to my colleagues than I am to my family. And through that shared exposure to risk and danger, through the way that we live in station life, essentially living together, it creates incredibly close bonds. So again, what does that do when a colleague takes their own life? So there are 4 themes that came through, and this is from my own PhD research, which speaks to how suicide threatens frontline workers' understanding of the world, other people and themselves. Conflicting truths, the liminal space, fears for the future, and reflections on the past. So conflicting truths, what I thought that I knew. And there's a real dissonance between what I thought I knew about the world, about myself, about other people, and what this suicide is representing for me. And it becomes an existential threat to the meaning of life. Because the one fundamental core truth that we think that we all know and is that you want to live and there is a desire to live. And we see stories of survival against all the odds over and over and over again in the media and in our world. So what does that do when there's an intentional act to end life? There's a real incomprehensibility where the way that we think in terms of rationalizing things, and that's how we problem solve, that's how we compartmentalize, but we can't make sense of this fundamental conflict in truth that exists with suicide. And there's a fracturing of relational trust. So many of my participants said to me, talking about the loss of a colleague to suicide, I thought I knew him. I thought he would have told me that he was struggling, and he didn't. And that they experienced very much as a betrayal of trust in the relationship. And that's really important. That sense of trust is so important in terms of levels of distress. So meaning discrepancies are central to the impact of suicide. The difference between the expectation, what I thought that I knew about the world, other people and myself, and the reality or our appraised meaning of that suicide for us, what this event essentially represents for me. And so there's a real incongruence and a sense of dissonance. The liminal space. So one of my participants, he said to me, and when I asked him, what's the hardest thing to come to terms with? And he said, the unknown and the uncertainty, short and long term. Those whys from the short term carry on and they affect every single day of your life. And that really speaks to that kind of reverberating why. So that initial question of why did someone take their own life, then starts to kind of translate into all sorts of other questions that can't be answered. And when you can't answer a question, how do you compartmentalize that experience? And it leads people into this liminal space of not knowing, which is really, really uncomfortable. And it relates to that relationship to control, of I can't control what I don't know. And if I can't control that, then how do I, again, find some sense of closure? And so it's experienced very much for firefighters as a threat to control and to certainty, which is really, really uncomfortable when you work in a command and control environment, and that's how you exist in the world. So there's some research done around, there's not been very much, interestingly, research around meaning making, but specifically within the liminal space and after suicide. So when someone has taken their own life, and this research was done in 2019, some people would make sense of it, and it led them to a determination not to take their own life. But other people found that suicide then became an option where it hadn't previously been an option. So there's a real opportunity, there's something going on in this liminal space that is the space where we've kind of disintegrated our sense of meaning in the world, and there's an opportunity to recreate that sense of meaning. So the liminal space offers an opportunity to support constructive meaning making and movement towards the meaning made of post-traumatic growth. Fears for the future, that sense of it could be me. And that was really characterized by a fear-based response and a projection into the future that made people question, am I okay? Because I thought he was really strong and I thought he was okay, but maybe this is going to be me, and could it be me? And also, especially in the context of what Leo was saying as well about how people personalize it, when they could personalize that to something in their life, they had their own children, it was like, are my children okay? Are they safe? What about them? And that kind of hypervigilant of what's going to happen in the future. There was also a reflection on the past of could I have? And that again is such a common question of could I have done something? And that's really characterised by that shame and guilt-based response. And firefighters talked about it as a perceived failure. And that speaks to an act of omission where I could have done something, but I didn't do it, and relates back to Dean's talk this morning, and that's a morally injurious event. And the could suddenly becomes a should. And that's where the shame comes in, which we know is associated with suicidality. And really importantly, it became a threat to firefighters' identity as a rescuer, which they're so tied to. And so that sense of, I'm the life protector, but I failed to do that. And therefore, it was experienced as a real assault on their sense of self-worth and also their belief in how good they were as a first responder and as a firefighter. So to summarise this little bit, the cultural and occupational context in which suicide occurs matters. Suicide fundamentally challenges frontline workers' worldviews and core belief systems, disrupting their understanding of the world, other people and themselves. Suicide is a unique type of traumatic and moral stressor for frontline workers that threatens our familiar learned ways of being in the world and in relation to other people. And suicide challenges our usual ways of coping with what we see in our roles. So what can we actually do? And so I want to broaden this to talk about the bigger picture because it's really important that suicide postvention sits within a much bigger picture. So this concept of preparedness, again, which both Leo and Tim spoke about, is so important. Are we prepared to have a postvention for when something might happen within our organisation? That sense of preparedness for postvention, but also is a vitally important part of prevention. We know, as I said, that postvention is also a really important part of prevention. So all of this has to form part of a bigger response strategy. So the principles of postvention for frontline agencies must be culturally responsive and situated. We can't take a program and go, I'm just going to put it within this organisation and then I've done what I needed to do. We must have a whole of organisation response. We know that the National Suicide Prevention Strategy speaks to the need for a whole of government response. And similarly, we must have a whole of organisation response. We can't rely on it sitting within our health and safety directorates, our wellbeing directorates. We need a whole of person in context approach. And that part of being in context is so important and so often missed and not spoken to. We need to co-create suicide postvention policy guidelines and procedures, embedding the voices of people with lived experience within that. So it actually meets the needs and speaks to the needs of the people that we're trying to serve. We need a bio-psycho-socio-spiritual approach. And again, that spiritual bit is so often missed. It's a whole of person impact. So we need a whole of person response. And that means we have to look beyond just biological and psychological and even sociological factors to look at the spiritual dimension. And again, Dean this morning spoke about that soul, injury to the soul, and very much suicide is an injury to the soul. It's a soul wound at an existential, fundamentally human and existential level. We must have defined and a staged approach to postvention, which identifies critical periods, so 24 to 48 hours, the time up to and including the funeral, 4 to 8 weeks, and 3 to 6 months, including anniversaries. But the response can't be time-bound, and it must focus on critical touch points along a person's journey. We don't sit into nice sequential, our journey of healing and response to anything, it's never sequential. We're always going round, and we have to meet people they're going to be in those different moments at different times, so meet them where they are along their journey. And we need to build cultures of care and compassion, where vulnerability is valued and seen as an act of courage and strength, where struggle is normalised, where it's safe to speak up, where command and control is reserved for the incident ground. And that piece is so important because it's embedded in us. The command and control piece comes out of the incident ground and infiltrates every bit of our organisations and how we exist. So prevention and preparedness. We need to have established postvention policies and procedures, and that includes having notification of death guidelines and templates already there that come both with and without consent from families to disclose the cause of death. We can't be scrambling around going, oh God, now how are we going to do this? To be able to inform our leaders of how do we disseminate that information. Have fact and information sheets available and accessible. Have established memorandums of understanding with appropriate postvention organisations, including standby support after suicide. So you have pre-existing relationships. All of our organisations are in different, some of us have mental health professionals embedded within them, some don't. But to have actually subject matter experts in suicide is a very specific area, existing relationships, because your capacity to respond within your organisation is likely to be overwhelmed when you have the death of a serving member. Have appropriately trained staff and consider a tiered approach according to the role. So for mental health professionals, peers, you might have, say, the Living Works tiered response to suicide prevention skills training. You might have like a 2-day assist type course, a 4-hour course for people that are sitting more at managerial level, and then maybe just a basic awareness and skills training for your sort of whole of organisation approach. Include conversation about suicide within wellness, wellbeing and resilience training. And, you know, I think this is so often missed. We want to talk about resilience all the time, but no one wants to talk about suicide. And for me, they should be part of the same conversation. You know, we teach people to have self-care and well-being plans, but why is not a safety plan a part of that? And so I think it's really important that this concept of democratising suicide safety planning, so it becomes a norm. We have that. It's part of what happens when we come into our organisation. It's part of our well-being and our self-care plan. We need to educate and identify and explore attitudes and belief systems about suicide, because when we can identify and address people's underlying belief systems, that dissonance that exists, the gap can be closed. So there's a real opportunity there in preparedness to educate. So the initial postvention crisis response, the first 24 to 48 hours, we need to allocate dedicated and appropriately trained person to coordinate the response. So it's who is that person going to be? Know who that person's going to be, a response coordinator. We need to have a trauma-informed approach. We need to appoint a family liaison officer, and that may be a chaplain or a mental health professional, but really important that we have that person, that trusted person to liaise with the family. We need to confirm the family's wishes regarding disclosure of the cause of death and the dissemination of information. That's such an important piece to establish very, very early on. We need to disseminate accurate, factual and psychosocially safe information. So ensure managers and response team have access to the safe language guidelines, the Mindframe guidelines. We'll be disseminating that, make sure everyone's familiar, it's part of their normal language system. 0 to 2 weeks leading up to and including the funeral. Determine the family tree of the deceased. As I said, we have very, very close relationships with people that exist, but that we work with, but often people will have a very close relationship with someone and then they've moved on, they've moved to a different station. So how can you try to find a way to see that kind of ripple effect of who is actually impacted? So usually if you have peers and trained peers within the organisation to help for that proactive outreach, to actually find out who has been impacted beyond what is obvious in terms of, you know, maybe people that are stationed with the person that died. Clarify leave arrangements for attendance at the funeral. You know, we had a funeral in Fire and Rescue not long before I left. There were 400 people at the funeral. But what are the leave arrangements and how are you going to backfill that position? People didn't know what leave they were allowed to take. Then they were told they weren't allowed to take leave. So have that established already. Be prepared for that. Respect the family's wishes, of course. And disseminate culturally contextualised fact and information sheets, both in hard and soft copy, and I'll show you one in a moment just as an example, and consider support for return to work. That's often a piece that's missed, especially if the death has occurred at a workplace or within the crew. Do people feel safe in returning to their workplace? Are there any additional needs that need to be met? So this just gives an example of standby support have very similar ones, but this has been contextualised to the firefighter world and the organisation. So those are the sorts of things you want to be having and adapting the basic information from standby support to your organisation and to your people. Medium term, 4 to 8 weeks. So have repeat check-ins. This is the time where if people are still experiencing ongoing difficulty in returning to functioning, so this might be a time where you have well checks or wellbeing check-ins and you arrange for people to have those. And you want to try and support the shift from intrusive rumination, so that kind of hypervigilance, to a more contemplative type of rumination. And that might involve questioning in the liminal space. So we're so risk averse now, and we know we're not very good at assessing risk of suicide. But allowing people to question within that liminal space. What does it mean for them? Explore. Has suicide become a realistic option for them? And if so, how can we reconnect them to meaning and supports that enable them to move through that in a way that makes them want to live? Create safe spaces to struggle, to talk, to question, and to seek help. And enable people to understand and make sense of their experiences, just allowing people to talk through. When people were talking in my PhD research, they'd talk for 2.5 hours, and then they'd go, "Thank you so much, I feel so much better." And I hadn't done anything, but being able to speak their experiences helped them to create a narrative around that, and that in itself was incredibly helpful. And that's why storied examples are so important, because they help people to understand their own experiences, and help them to reflect on the causes of suicide, what normal reactions are, ways of coping, and where to get help. So all the information that was on that sheet, actually using storied examples is really, really helpful for people to understand their own experiences, and give them permission as well to struggle, to normalise their reactions. And station visits for informal chats in a group format with a peer and a trained professional can be really helpful, just that informal, taking the intensity out of it, but allowing, again, safe spaces to talk. So the principles for reconstructing meaning in long-term postvention support transition from sense-making to meaning-making. And so that sense-making is that kind of cognitive, trying to rationalise something, and meaning-making is a much more integrative approach of integrating mind, body, spirit to become a sense of kind of becoming whole again. Reduce the meaning discrepancy by adjusting. So to do that, we can either adjust our worldviews, which is a process of accommodation, and that's when that sense of a whole person change, of I'm adjusting my whole worldview belief system, or our appraised meaning of suicide. That's where our attitudes to an understanding of suicide becomes really important. Focus on the quality of meaning making, and that's so important. That really matters. So the support processes related to acceptance, perceptions of growth, and opportunities for learning. Teach specific mental, emotional, and spiritual tools to address intense emotions, resolve internal dissonance, and integrate fractured belief systems, rebuild trust and social connections, and engage in compassion practices. Teach skills of problem-focused coping to build that sense of internal locus of control, to rebuild that sense of agency, which is so important, and a sense of self-empowerment. And focus on supporting the construction and reconstruction of coherent narratives around the event. And so those narrative techniques, whether it's expressive writing or narrative exposure therapy, are really, really powerful, especially in that kind of integrating the meaning-making processes. And it's that sense of being in the liminal space has been taken a lot from the rites of passage and transitions in life, and that the being in that liminal space is a disintegration of meaning. And so it's an opportunity to make meaning again, and using narrative techniques is a really helpful way to do that. Address existential and spiritual areas of meaning making. So allow people to question, what is the meaning of my life? We know that reconnecting people to meaning is fundamentally important in a crisis. When people are in a suicidal crisis, one of the things we do is get them to reconnect with something that matters to them, that makes them want to live. But to have that in the bigger picture when you're not in crisis is really, really important. What makes people want to stay alive and gives meaning to them. And encourage an exploration of bigger questions. Who am I? Who am I perceived to be by the media, by the general public? And who should I be? And that really supports the integration into identity, which is so important, so we don't have that kind of dissonance between who I think I should be and who I actually am. And offer suicide prevention skills training. And this is a really contentious thing. There's not like, yep, at 6 months it's all fine, we can just offer suicide prevention skills training. So consider the readiness, but certainly not before six months, but often people want to. It's a time when that's part of the reason why postvention is a really important part of prevention, because people want to do something. They want to know that they're empowered through skills to be able to prevent something happening like this happening again. So it's also an opportunity to tap into when people are ready and have processed that experience for themselves. But also safety plans are normalised and inbuilt into safe care plans, as I said. So the takeaways, suicide postvention must be embedded within and responsive to the unique occupational and cultural context of our organisations. Suicide is a different type of traumatic stressor that poses unique challenges to meaning making. Our response must reflect and address these challenges. Suicide postvention is prevention, and suicide postvention presents an opportunity for growth and learning individually and collectively. So are we ready to take that opportunity? Thank you.